Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 6 of CultureClubX, powered by CultureMonkey. I'm your host, Darcy Mehta. CultureMonkey is an AI-powered employee engagement platform that helps organizations listen to their employees and build stronger workplace cultures. CultureClubX is our global thought leadership forum where CHROs and people leaders share insights, explore trends, and exchange practical strategies for building future-ready organizations. Today, we're delighted to welcome Cezary Mączka, Group Chief People and Culture Officer at Wielton Group, a senior HR executive with deep international experience across EMEA and North America, and a proven track record of driving cultural and strategic transformation at scale. Cezary, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. So to give a little background, Cezary Mączka is a seasoned HR executive with a career built on delivering results across global multinational and European businesses at process, tactical, and strategic levels. He has led large-scale business transformations and reorganizations involving complex negotiations with unions and workers' councils, and has extensive experience integrating acquired companies and aligning them with new ownership. A versatile and well-rounded people leader, Cezary has a strong record in designing and implementing fair HR policies, driving digital transformation, and championing high-performance cultures. He brings deep knowledge of European labor law and international compliance, and has consistently operated at the executive and board level, building consensus across multiple organizational layers and forging strong relationships with stakeholders inside and outside the business. His areas of expertise span strategic and tactical planning, talent management, change management, shared services, employee relations, organizational design, and M&A integration. So, Cezary, your experience navigating the complexity of multinational organizations across cultures, labor traditions, and union structures makes you uniquely placed to speak about today's topic. And we are exploring closing the skills and trust gap, building a culture that drives engagement, retention, and performance. Before we get into our questions, could you just share a little bit about your own leadership journey and what shaped your thinking on culture and trust?
Darcy, thank you very much for this introduction. I think it's really nice to hear your 25 years plus professional history within 60 seconds. Actually, I don't know what I could extra. Only maybe two things: that I started my HR career with General Electric under the Jack Welch, who was transitioning to the new role to Jeff Immelt. And then after 11 years working with GE globally in different businesses, I moved to French organization EDF, Électricité de France, the biggest worldwide provider of nuclear energy. And finally, I ended up with a Spanish company called Ferrovial, which is the biggest construction company in Europe. Currently, I'm working for the Wielton Group, Polish-owned company, which is the third European and the ninth global producer of trailer and semi-trailers. And we have operations across European countries in UK, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and of course in Poland, employing more than 3,000 employees with revenues exceeding 1 billion euros. So in a nutshell, that's all about my history.
Well, that's quite a lot. You're right. We need a lot more than 60 seconds to cover it all, but you have a breadth of experience. So I'm so excited to get to chat with you today. So let's dive right into our first question. So what does the skills and trust gap actually look like inside a large industrial and multinational organization, and why do most HR frameworks fail to address it?
So let's start with three numbers that, in my view, best illustrate the nature of the skills gap and the trust gap in large organizations. First, about 70% of team engagement depends on the manager's attitude. Second, and it might be shocking, as many as 95% of managers do not have a clear understanding of the organization's mission, vision, and strategy. And third, it comes from the Gallup research. More than half of employees do not know exactly what is expected from them. Actually, it's 56%. So when you connect these three dots, facts, the picture becomes very simple. We have a system in which the people responsible for engagement do not understand the direction, and the people they manage do not understand their goals. So this is not a skills gap, in my opinion. This is a system gap. This is exactly where the problem begins for most organizations and for most HR models. Why? Because HR still too often, regrettably, operates alongside the business, not within it. We talk about HR strategies, competency models, development programs, but we do not start with the most basic question. You know what is the question? How does the companies make money? And where does it, and what does it lose it? And what we can do to build competitive advantage. And if you do not understand this, it's difficult to expect HR to propose solutions that truly close the skills gap. This becomes especially visible in how organizations approach people development. For years, we have known the 70-20-10 model. So it means 70 stands for 70% of learning from the job, 20% from learning from others, and 10% from formal training. But the problem is that most organizations do exactly the opposite. We focus on 10%, we buy off-the-shelf training, design one-size-fits-all programs, often disconnected from real business challenges, but delivered by well-known international providers, training providers, whose brand name is expected to be the guarantee of quality, which is not. And then we are surprised that nothing changes. Why? Because training alone does not build competence. Competence is built only when knowledge is applied in real work, in decisions, in outcomes, and foremost in accountability. So think about your own experience. Probably you attended several trainings. How long does the wow effect from a training session actually last? And how quickly do we, despite our own international commitments, revert to old habits, daily routines, and our materials end up on the shelf or in the trash? So,
exactly.
If managers do not change how they make decisions, and employees do not see any change after training their attendant or their managers, so it means that this is the moment when the skills gap and the trust gap converge. In large international organization, there is an additional dimension, the operating model. Basically, you can say that you have two models. The first one is centralized one. It's mainly typical US-based corporate model. We have consistency, we have control and standards, but we often lack local autonomy. Decisions are made at headquarters level, and managers become executors rather than leaders. And a lack of influence breeds frustration and distrust. On the other side, we have a federation model, federated model that provides greater autonomy, speed, and better alignment with the local markets. However, the risk is different here. Values might be interpreted differently, accountability is defined differently, and the leadership depends on maturity and strength of local leaders. So at the end of the day, and this what I can say based on my own experience, the organization can begin to drift culturally. It appears to be one company, but in reality it's not. An employee in one country experiences the company as a partner, while in another as a control structure. So this is exactly when the trust gap emerges, you ask in your question. So returning to the main questions, why do most HR models fail to solve this? Because they focus on tools rather than on the organizational operating model. They are not anchored in the business reality. The skills gap is not caused by the lack of training. It stems from the organization's inability to translate learning into actions that actually changes outcomes. That's why the answer does not lie in more HR initiatives. It lies in three things. First, the manager's accountability for both development and results. Second, in alignment between central and local levels. And third, in embedding HR within the business. So if I had to summarize in one sentence, the skills gap and the trust gap emerge when organizations lose alignment between what it declares and how it actually operates. In the US, we say walk the talk. So you know this experience. So until that is fixed, no HR model, no matter how sophisticated, will solve the problem.
Absolutely. Wow, you brought up so many interesting points, and what you said about HR being outside the organization rather, as part of it. That's such a huge difference. And like you said, if managers are just, tasked with execution, but they don't know the direction, how can employees know where you're going? So it's all a cycle, right? It seems simple, but it's, it makes such perfect sense. So this leads to the next question. How do you build a culture where people speak up, listen, and don't fear mistakes when operating across multiple countries, union structures, and deeply rooted European labor traditions?
So let me start with a light analogy. This question reminds me of a conversation between a doctor and a patient about how to lose weight and live a healthy life. There are plenty of prescriptions, but are people around the world actually healthy and fit? No. The issue is that it's not a lack of recipe, it's the lack of consistency and foremost discipline in execution. So again, let's look at the data. I would like to, all the time when I try to convey some message to back up by data that comes from the global advisory firms like Gallup or Kincentric. Data on employee engagement, which is in many ways a direct reflection of organizational culture. And these numbers really should concern us. Reports show that 60% of the global workforce is not engaged, and 15% is actively disengaged. While 34% of employees are doing well, 58% struggling, and 8% are in very difficult situations. So this lack of emotional connection to work reflects a broader deficit in motivation and productivity worldwide. Europe, a region with the strongest employee protections, the most developed social frameworks, and the highest regulatory maturity, ironically, has the lowest engagement level globally. Try to guess, at what level is Europe? 12%. Can you imagine 12%?
Wow.
And this is a fundamental paradox. We have built complex systems designed to protect people, yet often they limit individual sense of impact on the business.
Wow.
So if the question is how to build a culture when people speak up, listen, and are not afraid to make mistakes, we need to stop treating this as a culture issue. It's not a culture issue. It's not even primarily HR problem, although many organizations wrongly assumes that it is. It's a leadership quality problem. And again, as we said, 70% of engagement depends on the manager. So again, look at the data that we already discussed at the question number 1. But we can go even one step further. We know already that 95% of managers do not understand the company's mission and vision and strategy. But on top of this, 80% of managers, maybe let me phrase it, 80% of the processes have never been measured, what make really difficult to identify the problems and take corrective actions. And in case of managers, 90% of them improvise in their roles. if you ask them, how do you manage your people? They will not come with the answer with some kind of tools, routines, but they simply answer, I do manage normally. But what does it mean normal? Yeah? It's very subjective. So, and the last one on top of this is that people are reluctant to make a change. And they try to say that continuous improvement is something what slow down the business instead of accelerating this. So this is like a killing mixture, I would say. So let me outline a practical framework based on these three elements, what we should do to make the situation better. The first is around clarity. People do not speak up if they don't understand what the conversation is about. In many organizations, especially international and highly regulated ones, communications becomes either complex or politically correct, politically safe, we can say, yes. And in fact, it doesn't explain anything. And even an organization cannot clearly articulate where it makes money, what is the stance of the organization, and where it's heading to. It will not be the culture of dialogue. It will be the culture of assumptions, guessing. One is psychological safety, but not in a way that we describe this. It's not about comfort zone or absence of tensions. No organization can operate without tension, even in church, which by definition, yes, it's a perfect environment. So psychological safety means being able to say difficult things without the risk of political punishment, risk of retribution. And even those truths, if they are uncomfortable for the leadership, they are able to accept this. It's not necessarily mean that they agree with this, but at least employees should have a space to articulate this. But third, and the most important, I think, and most often overlooked, is accountability and leadership. If people have right to speak, but they are no responsible for decisions, as a group, we are not built a culture of engagement because we are building a culture of commentary, discussions, or criticism. And this is particularly visible in Europe. Strong employee representation structures are major asset, but if they are not combined with the real business understanding and shared accountability, dialogue quickly turns into positional negotiations. And what does it mean, negotiation? Negotiation does not mean trust on engagement. Negotiations, it's about winning, yes? Not solving the problems. That's something that you try to pose your point on the other part of the discussion, of the negotiation. So from my experience working across multiple EMEA countries, the pattern is surprisingly consistent regardless of the location and culture. If we do not focus on those elements, first clarity disappears, then trust disappears, then the willingness to speak the truth disappears, and finally engagement disappears. And again, returning to the data, to the hard facts, to the percentage of employees who are watching the market or who are actively looking for the new job. That might look or sound really shocking, because if we start with the sub-Saharan Africa, the region which is touched by the highest level of unemployment, can you imagine that 75% of the employees are actively looking for a new job in the region where it's not easy to get a job? In the US, in Canada, almost half, 49%. Europe, 39%. So what are the implications for the organizations in terms of cost, lost productivity, recruitment costs, onboarding costs? So the answer how to build a culture is actually simple, though not easy. We do not start with speak up programs. We do not start with communication campaigns. We start with, or we should start with radical transparency, business education, and I will talk about this later on, and involving people, including social partners, in real accountability for real business decisions. People start speaking only when they understand that they have a real impact on the organization where they are existing. And they start listening only when they see that conversations about shared reality, not two parallel narratives.
Exactly. Well, it will create momentum. Like you said, it's simple, it's not easy, but it's starting. And once you start and employees realize they are having an impact, they are being heard, it creates positive momentum. And then it's easier to do the next part and the next part. So, you know, and those numbers and statistics are just so fascinating and staggering too. So thank you so much for sharing that. And so again, this kind of leads into our next one. So what have complex union negotiations and workers' councils across EMEA taught you about where leadership trust breaks down? And what does rebuilding it actually require?
I will start with a bit provocative statement that trust in leadership in relations with social partners most often do not break down because of them. It breaks down because of leaders supported by highly paid, hired advisors from the big names. And usually it happens at three very specific moments. The first one, when leaders stop telling the truth. Instead of clearly saying, we have a problem, like the famous statement, hello, Houston, we have a problem. Yes.
Yes.
But here we are talking not about rocket science, we are talking about costs, margins, and future of business. And simply stating that we are not competitive. So leaders begin to communicate half-truths or polish HR messages without substance. And people, especially social partners, sense this very, very quickly. The second one, when decisions are made without context. Salary reductions, benefit changes, restructurings. These are difficult, but they can be defended. What cannot be defended is saying just, this is our decision. This is elected by the HQ or whatever. If you do not present data and realities, if you do not include the perspective of the social partners, that's the moment when the distrust becomes. And also, if you do not show the context and purpose behind all those decisions. And third, when leaders themselves do not understand the business they manage. And as we said, 90% of the managers is not able to articulate clearly the mission, vision, and strategy. Just try to make this test to your colleagues from the companies that you are talking to. Just ask the simple question, what's the mission, vision? And you can see how many people struggling simply to summarize this in one or two sentences. So yet it sounds harsh and uncomfortable, but it's true.
Yeah. Hey, that's why we're having these discussions, right? And it is shocking, you know, like you said, that can't even struggle to explain the mission statement and everything. So, you know, you've got a really interesting way of looking at it, and it makes perfect sense. So you believe clarity of goals matters more than change management itself. How do you put that into practice when organizations are mid-transformation and people are overwhelmed and disengaged?
Yep. Let me start with the old Chinese proverb. If you don't know where you are going to, any road will take you there. But it doesn't work in business. So I'd like to start with the personal story because I think it best illustrates the point. A few years ago, I worked for the multinational company that was undergoing a major transformation in one of its European markets. It was mainly driven by the regulatory changes implemented by European Union, cost pressure, and the aging workforce, what forced us to make a shift in the strategy and consequently to implement new operating model. At the level of presentation to headquarters, everything looked right. a roadmap, communication plan, leadership workshops, even information sessions with trade unions. But people were frustrated and increasingly disengaged. Most of all, they were uncertain about what the future held for them. So we conducted a deep dive workshops following an engagement survey. And the conclusion was clear. If we wanted the transformation to succeed, we had to explicitly explain where the change was coming from, how it would affect people, how long it would take, and what kind of support we needed from them, and how critical, finally, the engagement was to the company's future. So together we defined a set of principles based on really absolute transparency, involving not only leaders, HR, but also trade unions. And by the way, the penetration of trade unions in terms of employees population was at level of 90%. And within the group, we had 22 trade unions and works councils. So it shows the complexity of the negotiations and discussions. So we decided to break down a multi-year transformation into quarterly priorities for each of the business units. No more than 3 priorities at a time, each with a clear explanation why. And the goal was to eliminate ambiguity so employees could focus and take ownership. We also changed the communication model. Instead of emails and presentations, we introduced a simple rhythm of short weekly conversations. What mattered most, what is blocking us, what has changed. And the last element was really a breakthrough because it addressed a fundamental question, what is each employee place in the future organization? And we decided to introduce 3 groups within the population of the employees. Group A had the qualifications to take on the expanded roles in the new structure. Group B, employees demonstrated the willingness to acquire the necessary future skills. And Group C, those who chose voluntary exit programs. What was the result of this? That everybody knew the path towards the future and what's needed to happen just to succeed on the individual and on the company level. And what is also important that it didn't cost us an extra money. We didn't change the strategy. We didn't change the transformation budget. We simply added tools that enabled people to build new competences, directly linked with the business goals, the future operating models, and the strategy. And that is exactly when engagement started to rise. During a period when we were restructuring nearly 50% of the workforces, can you imagine that the employee satisfaction level placed us amongst top organizations recognized as investors in human capital or top employers? Mm-hmm. And I think this is extraordinary result. Wow. So, one more example, when I am deeply convinced that the clarity of goals is really the game changer for the company's strategy, maybe not directly linked with the transformation. This one comes from the construction business. I used to work for Budimex. As I mentioned, one of my experience was working for the biggest European construction group, Ferrovial. And in this group, performance comes from a simple principle. Goals are set by those accountable for delivery, not by headquarters. Project leaders define targets, break them into execution phases, and assign ownership. So every person knows what they own and how success translates into financial outcomes. Mm-hmm. And what is the outcome of this? Budimex market cap is bigger than all construction companies listed on the Warsaw Stock Exchange combined. Mm-hmm. One company value is higher than all construction companies working in this environment. So that's why I believe clarity of goals matters more than change management processes at itself. Yes.
I believe it too.
Yeah. Thank you very much for being convinced.
You've convinced me.
But if you look from this perspective, look, the change manager, in fact, is try to convince people to accept change, yes? But clarity of goals give them direction to act. So that's the difference. And also, I think one more important point, in everyday work, and especially during transformation, people do not need communication. Again, they need clarity, because if you know what you should deliver, you will deliver. You will not be guessing. You will be really thinking how to do this, what type of support you need from the managers or from the organization. So let me be really crystal clear. Without clear goals, there is no engagement. And that's on activity. And activity is not the same as effectiveness. And I think this is one of the pathologies of the business, if I can call it in this way, that people come to work simply because they need to earn a living. So they do not come with a purpose that they want to change something. They do not come that they are proud to working for some brand. So if we forget about this, we are in a situation that we are not able to have employees on our side to help us as leaders to build the competitive advantage. So anyway, coming back to the change management, so we should not make assumption that people have bad intention or they resist change. It's not true. People do not resist change, they resist chaos. So and the role of leaders and HR, but for most leaders, is to provide a clear, realistic, time-bound goal, one that is grounded in the partnership between employees and managers.
Absolutely. Well, you explained that very clearly, and both of your personal examples definitely, convince me why that is. You can definitely see the direct correlation. And I like how you made the distinction between communication and clarity. We always say communication is key, of course, but it's the clarity of goals, because if you're just saying this needs to be done, that's communication. But why does it need to be done? What is the goal? Where are we going? Type of thing. And like you said, activity, it doesn't mean effectiveness. And, it's that feeling of, I'm being busy and we're having a lot of activity and things are happening, but is it being effective? And that's completely different. So
actually, I can give you one more example, which is slightly related with the negotiations with unions as well. As you know, and as we discussed in European labor law realities, unions are playing very pivotal role, because without their consent or at least information, consultation, you cannot implement any strategical changes. And that's example of this French company EDF. When we started to make this restructuring, civil restructuring, about 50% of the workforces. I mentioned about analysis and outcome that comes from the engagement surveys, but also what we decided to do, we decided to involve trade unions and works councils. And why it was important? When we started to convince them to change something, they say, we are not focusing on the economical aspect of the business activities. We are social staff. So we don't want to hear about numbers. And I said, it's not the right approach. That's again, you and us as leaders, we should a clear and common understanding of our goals. And the goal for the company is to provide employees with the jobs and provide with the benefits for the shareholders, and also work for the local communities. So we decided not to convince them simply that we should achieve an agreement on severance packages. I implemented something which is quasi-leadership program for trade unions. We call this Social Academy. And it was not, I would say, theoretical and soft one. It was very hard business education about how P&L works, what is cash flow, how cost structure look like, and what is real operational constraint. And the key element was that we forced them to make decisions how to effectively run the company. And very quickly, it became that if they wanted to maintain job and salaries for their members, they had to make exactly the same difficult decision they had previously challenged.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah? So, and that was the turning point, because that was not more us versus them. Yes, we started to look at the same goal, ultimate goal of existence of the company. So again, that's I am deeply convinced, and I deeply believe in the clarity of goals.
I'm deeply convinced too. Absolutely. So, okay, moving on to our next question. How do you close a skills gap without widening a trust gap? And we've kind of covered this. And what does a people strategy look like that builds capability and psychological safety simultaneously?
So, as always, I will be direct. So I think that
Please do. I appreciate that.
Most organizations do not have a skills gap problem. They have a trust gap problem disguised as a skills gap, which is a big difference. When companies talk about reskilling, upskilling, what do you think? What employees hear? Probably they hear something different than we intend to convey the message. Am I still needed? Or am I about to be replaced? Yes. So this is the moment when the trust gap begins. So if you try to close a skills gap with training alone, what we discussed, yes, you will almost always widen the trust gap, because skills are not just about capability, they're about identity, status, and future security. And I have seen this repeatedly in large-scale transformations. The mistake organizations make it treating capability building as a learning problem, but it's not. It's, again, clarity, consequence, and if I could explain this maybe more in details. As we discussed in the past, it starts with the radical transparency. People need to understand why the skills gap exists and what does it mean for the business and what does it mean for them individually. Not in abstract terms, but in concrete roles, specific implications. In this case, I discussed in the past, we decided to squeeze 60 jobs into 16 jobs.
Wow.
And in the same way, restructure 50% of the workforce. But we show the people the way how can be there and what type of support from the company they will need. So that's about clear future pathways. And in every transformation, we should define some scenarios. The first one, who can grow into the future model? Who can reskill with support of the organization, and those for whom there is no long-term role. And this is probably the most harsh one. It's not easy, but ambiguity destroys faster than difficult truth. And I can also come up with some example. When we made restructuring, while I'm working for GE, we announced the restructuring 2 years in advance, that it will happen 2 years, 24 months. And do you think it negatively impact the productivity? No. People understood and appreciated that you are open.
Absolutely.
That clearly we say upfront what will happen for them. So it gave them this psychological safety. They felt appreciated. And also they had a time to take care about themselves. So they were able to look for a job, look at the market, and also use the outplacement products. So it's not easy, but it's better harsh truth than half truth. And the third one, I think, is ownership and capability. Building must be owned by the business, not by HR. So, in other words, managers must be capable for developing their teams. And employees must see a direct link between new skills and real opportunities, role expansion, mobility, or compensation. And the fourth one, I would say, it's visible consequences. So it means if learning has no consequence, we said, if you do not see the changes in the KPI, if you do not see changes in the manager's behavior, it has no meaning. People need to see new skills, change outcomes, what gets promoted, who leads the project, who stays, who exits. So this is how you build the credibility. So, summing up the people strategy, it's not about training programs, it's about transparency, clear pathways, ownership, and consequence. I understand that I repeat this several times, but I think it's really important that we start with the basics. We do not try to reinvent the wheel. So we do not close a skills gap by teaching people new skills. We close it by giving them a clear, credible future and holding organizations accountable for making the real future. If I say organization, I mean leaders. Because very often what you can face in daily business is that managers said, I would do this for you, but I am not allowed by HR, which is complete bullshit. Yes?
Right. Absolutely. I just like that phrase, radical transparency. That really sums it up. I mean, it really does. So like you said, it's not reinventing the wheel, but it's understanding these key concepts and actually implementing them. So, okay, talking about the Western region, what do HR leaders in the Western region consistently get right about building high performance cultures, and where do they remain dangerously blind?
So, again, coming back to the paradox of the European HR, I think it's simple. As I mentioned previously, we have one of the most advanced people management systems in the world. And at the same time, the lowest level of employee engagement. As you mentioned,
crazy.
12%. So, what HR leaders in Western countries do exceptionally well, they are able to connect HR with the business, understand the P&L, have a seat at the decision-making table. They work efficiently with the data, using advanced analytics to make decisions about people and organizations. They invest in leadership, knowing that managers are the primary carriers of the culture and performance, as we said, 70%. And all of this seems to work, but up to the point we start assuming that this model is universal. At the moment, Western Europe falls into what I call comfort trap. Comfort trap means that we have created an environment that is in fact very safe. Stable employment, strong employee protection, mandatory social consultation, predictable, highly regulated working conditions. Can you imagine that based on seniority in Germany, you can have up to 7 months notice period? It's, from the US perspective, it's shocking, yes? 7 months. And if you want terminate the contract, you need to pay severance payment. Severance payment, it means usually half month salary per 1 year of service. In some situations, looking at the social surroundings of the employee, some employees are not being able to terminate. So this strong, stable environment gives a value, but also it comes at a cost. And because engagement, as we discussed, does not come from comfort. Engagement comes from the sense of the impact and influence. And in many European organizations, the sense of impact comparing to the US or Latin America is really limited. This social dialogue creates the situation that in some situations, many union leaders, union managers are part of the board of directors. So they are part of the decision-making process. And in that case, the decisions often require long and complex consultations processes. So as a result, line managers who are responsible, as we discussed, for 70% of the team engagement have limited agency. And this is completely fundamental difference between Europe and regions as the United States and Latin America, because in those regions, managers have greater influence over decisions, greater accountability for results, and more freedom to act. And where there's agency, engagement follows. And the second area where HR leaders remain dangerously blind is their belief in tools. Western HR is excellent in building diagnostic systems, engagement surveys like CultureMonkey, even platforms, competency models. But the problem is that these are perfect tools, but they show what doesn't work. They do not fix problems, yes? So if nothing changes after survey, you do not build engagement, you build frustration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the third area, which is a big mistake, also comes from the United States, but also from the Western companies that are moving their operations to other part of the globe, is that they attempt to transfer models, but it doesn't work. Why? The same values, tools, processes, but what is copied but does not reflect local conditions, cultural conditions, make the situation really difficult, and in fact the engagement is declining. Because copied model without taking into consideration the local realities is not the right one. So we can say that answering to the questions what we could do better and what we failed to deliver is that we too often assume that the model is more important than the context in which it operates. This focus on the tools, on the values, but not without the context. And the truth is opposite. The model is not so important. What is really important is aligning the model with the reality, with the business reality, social reality, and cultural reality. And until HR accept this, it will continue to design increasingly sophisticated solutions, even supported by AI recently. But in practice, it will deliver weaker and weaker results.
So, talking about engagement leads us to our last question. How can real-time engagement platforms like CultureMonkey help complex multi-country organizations turn employee sentiment into decisions that meaningfully close the trust and skills gap?
Yeah, that's a tricky question.
But we're not making it easy for you.
but I'm a big fan of the platforms like CultureMonkey and other, say, continuous listening tools, if I can call this, because they address a key managerial challenge today. They reduce the distance between what people feel and the decision the company makes. And if you remember about history, engagement surveys were conducted once every 2 years and complemented by annual pulse surveys. And data was analyzed and actions were implemented months later. Sometimes even often forgot what was the biggest issue that came from the survey. And what's more, this was corporate initiatives delivered by global vendors with a little flexibility to adapt questions to local context, frequently even with imposed language that created barrier for many employees. Today, technology enables real-time data collection and analysis that changes everything. At one at one push of the button, you can change the language version. In the survey I asked questions in Polish that are translated to 19 languages. So it creates a big advantage for the employees, for the HR, for the leaders. So in the past, we spoke extensively about transparency, accountability, and the role of the leadership in building organization. And these tools are now a logical step in making those ambitions real. Mm-hmm. But as we discussed, especially the questions within the survey that we ask employee must be clearly defined. They have to clearly define purpose, because these are not tools for measuring the mood of the employee. They are tools for managing culture, particularly in multi-country organizations, and we need to take this into consideration. Because in an environment where we operate across 10, 15 countries with different legal frameworks and cultural norms, the only true common denominator is not the process, but the company values and leadership culture. Values, culture that comes from the mission and vision. And that's where these platforms create, in my opinion, real value, because they allow us to see whether values are understood consistently across countries such as Poland, France, Germany, US, Canada, whether a speak-up culture works in practice or only exists on paper, and where are the gaps versus the intended model. Mm-hmm. However, again, to underline one critical point, these tools do not build an engagement or trust. They only show gaps. They only show the missing points. Mm-hmm. So that's why the survey itself changes nothing. Mm-hmm. But what is the follow-up? But what matters is the follow-up and how organizations address the issues that are raised within the surveys. Mm-hmm. And again, if after survey we do not see the change management practice, leadership KPIs, or decision-making process, we do not build a culture of transparency. We build, I would call this, cynicism and the illusion of dialogue.
The illusion of dialogue. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this is very dangerous in the European context with the strong employee representation structures, yes? Mm-hmm. Feedback actions quickly turns into frustration or even conflict. So let us remember that the ultimate purpose of engagement measurement is to increase productivity and strengthen business performance by having happy people on board.
Absolutely. That's better for everyone, right? So, Cezary, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experience with us today, and your perspective on closing the skills and trust gap shaped by years of navigating complex multi-country organizations, union negotiations, and large-scale transformation is exactly the kind of grounded, practical thinking that today's people leaders need. It's clear that building a culture that drives engagement, retention, and performance isn't a one-time program. It's a continuous commitment to clarity, trust, and listening at every level of the organization. That's precisely where CultureMonkey plays a critical role through real-time pulse surveys and AI-powered listening that helps organizations surface sentiment early, act with confidence, and build cultures where both skills and trust can grow together. Before we close, Cezary, how can our listeners connect with you and continue this conversation?
I think the ideal way is just connect through LinkedIn. You can set an invite, but there's one small request from my side. Just do not ping the request. If you could just add one sentence why you want to connect.
That makes perfect sense. Well,
that this is the reason of this interview. That also works perfectly well.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Well, I will connect with you and be saying, because I enjoyed speaking with you in this interview. So for sure. So it was really wonderful talking to you, and to all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to follow, share, and subscribe. And that's a wrap for this episode of CultureClubX powered by CultureMonkey. Until next time, I'm your host, Darcy, signing off.